for your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Dero.
Well, greetings, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. You're listening to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I almost said Mysterious Library, which I also do on this network at Tuesday at 9 p.m. live with the always entertaining and insightful Jason McLean. We're lucky we have a show tonight. I ran into so many technical problems setting up, which I normally don't. And I have a theory. 75 years or thereabouts ago, in the pages of Amazing Stories, the top science fiction pulp magazine of the day in America, edited by the one and only RaymondAPalmer, was a series of stories introduced known as the Shaver Mystery. According to the author Richard Shaver, he claimed that beneath the surface of this planet, there was a race of creatures called Dero. They were twisted both spiritually and physically by the ancient mech that was left in those caverns by an even more ancient race that had once probably been their masters that had fled to space when the solar rays became radioactively poison on this planet. Beneath the planet, the Dero preyed upon humanity, abducting them to the caverns and hitting them frequently with tamper rays, especially when people were getting too close to the truth about the Dero, as they did for Richard Shaver's almost entire life, at least according to Shaver. Now, here's the rub. The other day, for the first time in my life, I stepped on the hallowed ground, which was Richard Shaver's farm in Lanark, Wisconsin. It took me a little time to find it. I had to go to a deeds office and then the land zoning office to get the map for the original deed. But sure enough, I found it and I visited it. And it was strange to be at the place where, in many ways, Shaver believed he finally found proof this ancient now extraterrestrial race which had fled, called the Sea People, and there were the Atlanteans and, of course, the Lemurians. And he found on this property ancient rock books, which Shaver believed contained pictorial records of this ancient pre-diluvial civilization. And his property in Lanark was supposedly sitting on the top of perhaps an ancient temple or settlement or the like. Anyway, I can't think of anybody who I would like to talk about this topic with more tonight than our guest. I'm, as I probably said on the show before, currently making a documentary called The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, all about RaymondAPalmer and Richard Shaver and the Shaver Mystery and how it impacted UFO belief. And tonight's guest is very conscious of all of those developments, along with many more. So we'll be hitting the Shaver Mystery, we'll be hitting Mothman, we'll be hitting all kinds of other weird things. So please stick around. This is going to be an incredible show. So our guest, he's been fascinated for over half a century by the unexplained. He grew up in Michigan, and he was there during the March 1966 UFO flap. It occurred virtually in his backyard. And the following November, of course, a winged humanoid chased two couples down a lonely country road near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the legend of the Mothman was born. Tonight's guest has been chasing the Mothman pretty much for the rest of his life. He was influenced by thinkers that are also an influence on me, like Keel and Jacques Vallee. His views on UFOs became unconventional. He moved more towards that type of paranormal explanation that those authors had introduced. His main area of research is what some call high strangeness, or window areas, as Keel dubbed them, where disparate types of paranormal phenomena all seem to occur in the same location. He believes that studying these paranormally active locations may be the key to understanding the origin of these manifestations. He also has his own podcast, which is awesome, called The High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK radio network, and is a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files. At least he used to be. I think he still is. I'll have to check. It's also on that network. He currently lives in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and works at the Mothman Museum. And he's writing a book that deals with the underlying patterns that connect different types of paranormal phenomena throughout history. So I'm delighted to welcome back to Talking Weird my good friend and colleague, the one, the only, Steve Ward.
Thanks, Dean. That was a great introduction. I think I wrote it.
I played with it a little bit. It's a wonderful bio. But yes, so I had the Dero tampering with me, I think, tonight. Everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. My light, my camera, my microphone, my cables. Oh, it was unbelievable.
It's good to have the rays from the mech deep beneath the earth to blame for all our mishaps here on the surface.
Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about the shaver mystery?
Well, see, I think back when we had that wave of UFO sightings in March of '66, I went to my local library, found every book I could on UFOs, which included some of the weird contactee stuff. And then I was subscribing to everything you could imagine, Saucer News, Fate magazine, and one of the magazines was Flying Saucers, published by Ray Palmer. And this is before I knew, anything about his publishing record. I mean, he's the one that took over the Pulp magazine, as you mentioned, Amazing Stories. I think about, was it 39, late 30s, maybe early 40s.
Yeah, early 30s, I think he took it over.
Okay, late
30s. Yeah, about 38
right.
to 39. And then he was there for over a decade. I think he left in 49, I believe. So he was there for a bit over a decade.
It was a failing magazine, and he turned it right around. And then later on, when he struck gold with the Shaver mystery, I'll talk about that in a minute, the circulation went crazy. And some of his fellow editors were a little bit jealous, especially when he was stealing paper, which had quite a shortage because of the war from their other publications. But so I think that's where I first started reading about the Shaver mystery was, Palmer would talk about everything in his magazines. I went on to subscribe to Form and Search, and any other magazine that he had at the time. And I didn't, I think actually when I was very young, my mom was reading something, I think, about the Shaver mystery. I think in retrospect, she was talking about this guy that lived in Wisconsin that talked about devils under the earth. And the worst devils were the ones living under Wisconsin or something like that. That's about all I remember. So years later, in putting this together, I think, my God, my mom must have stumbled on the Shaver mystery. But he, as you said, it started with Ray Palmer received this letter called a new alphabet or something like that. It was what he called the Mantong alphabet. And this was the alphabet that all other alphabets sprang from somehow. And so he listed this. And so Palmer, and before that, it's classic because who was it? Howard Brown.
Harold Brown, yeah.
Oh, he and Howard Brown were not getting along. Howard Brown edited things like Mammoth Western and Mammoth Detective and so forth. Palmer got to be in charge of everything. And Brown gets this letter from Richard Shaver, who's living in Pennsylvania, with this crazy alphabet. And he said, man, this guy's a wacko. He wads it up and throws it in the basket. And probably just to irk Howard Brown, Ray Palmer goes in, unravels it, and then prints it in the next issue, for his readers' consideration. And it had quite a response. And then in the meantime, Richard Shaver, who he sent Palmer a 10,000-word manuscript, I believe, called A Warning to Future Man. And it's briefly what that is. He claimed that he had been imprisoned for 6 or 7 years in the underworld by these Dero, which meant detrimental robot, not literally a robot, but they were so malformed in mind and spirit that they were almost robotic. And they had this ancient mech, he called it, which had been leaking radiation for years and was responsible for messing with them. And but he also believed that they could send these rays out, and it's kind of like a modern day devil theory. You could they could control, they could cause accidents, they could cause people to go crazy and murder other people, and they were not easy to look at either. They were kind of bloated with trunk-like noses and really bad dispositions. So, so anyway, he claimed it, and somehow, did you ever hear the interview that Long John Nebel did?
It's fantastic.
Oh, it was on the old Long John Nebel show out of WOR in New York, the forerunner to Art Bell. And he had, at that time, strangely enough, Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver were living almost next door to each other in Wisconsin. They had been partners. I mean, he started sending, I know I'm going all over the place, but he started sending Palmer these manuscripts, and then Palmer would rewrite them and cover them up and publish them in Amazing Stories. And people wanted to hear more cave stories. And there were, extra features about the caves and about Shaver, and the letters coming in. Some of them were just crazy. But so this one night, Long John Nebel had them both on his show. And this is, ancient technology. They had to use something called radiophone. So you hear this little beep every once in a while. Mm-hmm. But he asked Richard Shaver, he said, well, how did you get out of the caves? And he said it was a mistake. But then they didn't follow up on it. So what was it, a clerical error? Some incompetent Dero stamping the wrong paper? It's
a wonderful interview.
It is, but there's so much. It's fascinating, and I did a couple talks on the Shaver mystery.
Oh wow!
And
you're clearly very knowledgeable on it. So
well, it's there's so much to cover. But he stop me when you need to. But Ray Palmer was fascinated by this guy, and he was publishing his stuff, and of course he was adding to it and so forth. But he decided to make the trip all the way to Pennsylvania. Now he was based in Chicago area, right? I think when he was doing Amazing Stories.
Yeah, that's when Amazing Stories. Ziff Davis was run out of Chicago.
Okay,
right.
And so he went there and he visited. He was talking with Shaver and his wife one night, and so they went upstairs to bed, and then. Now his room joined Shaver's room. Apparently, if he had to go off and go to the latrine, he had to walk through their bedroom to go downstairs. So he's laying there at night, and his original story was, he said he started hearing these different voices, and maybe 3 or 4 of them. One was a woman, one sounded like a child, and they're talking about. It turns out that these guys were supposed to be the Dero. Now, the Dero were the good guys. They weren't quite as messed up. They didn't have as many internal issues, but they were talking about this horrible crime that had happened, that this woman had been murdered. It was just a horrible situation. Now, this happened from what the voices were saying, and he's listening to this 4 miles away and 4 miles beneath the earth. And so he interjects, he says, who is this? Who's talking here? And the younger voice, the kid, says, tell him. He told him to shut up. Don't listen to him. He's an idiot. So Shaver, rather Palmer claimed the next day he's looking all over the place for speakers, wires, and everything. Now I'm going to jump way ahead years later.
Sure.
It turns out he changed the story a little bit. The voices were actually coming from Richard Shaver as he slept. And one time when Richard Shaver had fallen asleep on the couch at the Shaver's house around the Christmas holidays, one of Palmer's daughters was walking by, and she heard voices coming from him as he was sleeping. Now that's really weird. I mean, I think we've all heard tapes of what people claim are possessions. Of the devils, and you'll hear these different intermingled voices. Now, I don't know if there's any connection to that or not, but totally bizarre that they were coming from him.
It's a strange story. I mean, I love it. I've been captured so much by this story, and it was that Long John interview that you're talking about which set me off on my current journey, because in that interview, when I was listening to it, Long John says, on the phone, we have Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer from Amherst, Wisconsin. And I went, is Amherst far from where I am? So I Googled it, as you do, Google mapped it. And it was like, 50 minutes away. It's the bordering county. And I was like, and then I researched more, and Shaver and Palmer lived essentially in the county over. So that's what gave me the initial idea to make this documentary, because their stomping grounds were so close. I mean, Rock Fogo the Shaver rock art started on that property I stepped on for the first time on Wednesday. So I'm really ground zero. So the story you just told, that radio story, that's literally what the thing that triggered my modern interest. I'd written about them when I did my PhD dissertation, and I agreed with I agreed with John Keel's analysis that Palmer was essentially the man who invented flying saucers, which we can get to as well, probably. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the Shaver mystery laying so many of the ideas of UFO belief that came after. So I was already conscious of them. But to find out somehow this kid from Sydney, me, now a man who'd done his PhD dissertation and written extensively about Palmer and Shaver, now by a weird twist of fate, lived in the neighboring county. It was a trippy moment for me. I won't lie. It was like, I know you went to Point Pleasant because Point Pleasant called because you were already conscious of it. I wasn't even conscious of it, and I ended up next door to them. So it very strange.
That is very strange. You've mentioned Richard Toronto before. Richard Toronto knew Richard Shaver. He's one of the groupies that would go down to his farm. I think it was when he was in Arkansas, if I'm not mistaken. But he's written some great books.
They're fantastic. In fact, I have one right here just to hold up because I happen to be reading it at the moment. The Rock Fogo book, which is about the art that he started to do when he was in Lanark. And then you're right, he moved to Arkansas, Summit, Arkansas. But yeah, and of course, War Over Lemuria, which I know you've read as well, and Shaverology and Shavertron. People should go and get those books. If this conversation is of interest to you and you want to know more, go and buy the books by Richard Toronto. There's several and they're all spectacular.
Right. And War Over Lemuria covers both Shaver and Palmer and how they intermingled and how they came together.
It's one of my favorite books I've ever read. I love it.
And the Shaver Home Companion is all this extra stuff. Now, what's the name of the guy? It was a very short man that lived north of San Francisco. His name went out of my head. He lived with his mother in an old Victorian mansion.
I know who you mean. And he was shooting at them. He was shooting at the Dero or something, right? I forget his name though.
He claimed there was a cave on his property.
Yeah.
And he claimed that they could see these shadows moving around at night, and sometimes they'd see the doorknob be twisted. Sounded like a perfect setup for a horror movie. Yeah. Well, he's writing all these letters. And I wish I could think of his name.
I've forgotten his name too. He's in those biographies though, and you can also read his letters in Amazing Stories. They ran a bunch of those letters, if I recall.
Well, he described things like black cars moving along the road outside his house and moving too fast for the condition of the road and then somehow disappearing. They talked about some people that investigated the area, and I think one ended up with missing time. A couple guys supposedly got a photograph of some kind of creature. It's one of these grainy photographs. I'm trying to think. Anyway, there were several things that he claimed happened. And this is before the advent of UFOs and Men in Black and all this sort of thing. It was like a precursor to the modern day folklore or history. I don't know. But there's, like you said, there is so much. It's such a rich field. And one other thing, did you follow what was it? James Tilly Matthews, the Welsh tea merchant that in the 1700s? He had kind of a similar delusion, if you will, where he believed in the basement of the House of Commons
was heirloom.
The heirloom, yes, the heirloom gang. And it was, I don't know how it was run by pneumatics, air operated somehow with sails and baffles and so forth. I'm not sure where the wind was coming from and locked up in a basement. But he believed that rays were coming out of that basement and messing with them. He called one a kiting ray that would, almost like some of the Shaver stuff, trying to confuse your mind.
It's very similar.
And remember how Shaver would have names for some of the, like Max the Dero. And of course, there was Nydia, who was kind of a undercover angel, if you get my drift.
Mm-hmm. She was a tarot. And she was a tarot.
Yeah. And she was quite a friend. But anyway.
You can say that again.
Matthews had, it was Billy the Kid. And he had, it was very, very similar to Shaver. They called Matthews the first case of schizophrenia. 100 years later, they called it.
It's interesting because that idea in the psychiatric literature, when you think it's a machine which is sending you these messages, they now call it, there's a name for it, it's an influencing machine. And so when you go back and you look at some of the Shaver stories and the heirloom story and all of these fit that kind of pattern, which of course kind of throws a very weird spanner into the wrench, because if so much of ufology is based upon the precursor of the Shaver mystery, and if the Shaver mystery is just the imaginings of somebody who was mentally unwell, it's a very weird underpinning for one of the biggest belief systems on the planet today.
Well, I suspect.
It's fascinating.
Well, I suspect that I think Shaver wasn't just, in quotes, crazy. I think he was tapped into a source of information. He would get these ideas and so forth. Now, like channeling. Now, it doesn't mean that that information is objectively real or whatever, but I don't think we can just say that, well, he was schizophrenic or whatever. That doesn't seem to explain what he had gone through. And, this, I think one of the reasons that you and I and so many people are interested in this, it taps into something, I don't know, primal? Is that a little bit too dramatic?
Or archetypal. I mean, there is something there that truly resonates when you read the Shaver mystery stories. There's something going on.
All the great heroes went to the underworld. Odysseus, Aeneas, so it's just this common theme where, I wish we had more time. They got these great letters. I mean, some are really cool, like the shadows moving on the property. But then you had the Hutchison brothers wrote about how they must have had fun in the letter room there. How when their pet turtle died,
that's right.
They started getting information on the Shaver mystery. Now, nobody seemed to ask why the turtle didn't say much when it was alive.
And of course, there's rumors that Rapp himself, Raymond Palmer, may have written some of, I don't think anyone suggested the turtle letters, but that some of it he might have stirred up as well for publicity. But who knows? I do think that there is something very significant that as you said, it has that archetypal resonance. And when it came out in the magazine, according to Palmer, and let's take him to a degree at face value here, because the more I read about the man, the more I like him. Ditto with Richard Shaver. I feel ridiculously close to both of these men who have passed now, because I spend all my time doing nothing but reading their writings and visiting their old stomping grounds. But to take Ray Palmer at face value, he said, I think Amazing Stories got something like 50,000 letters from people saying they'd had similar experiences, or they'd heard the voices, or they'd been in the caves. And of course, one of those is somebody we've talked about on Talking Weird before, when we had Brian Shickley, the animator, on with his wonderful animation, Fred Chrisman Cave of the Space Nazis. And that's Fred Chrisman. Fred Chrisman wrote a letter to Amazing Stories saying that he fought the Dero in the caves during World War II.
Yeah.
You might want to fill the audience in on that story if you can remember it. They've heard me about such things enough.
Fred Chrisman had crossed paths with Shaver before, and I believe he was behind the Maury Island hoax, was a whole nother story. But he claimed in a letter he was shot down with a buddy in World War II, somewhere near Burma, and they were in a cave, and they were attacked by these creatures, apparently Dero, and they zapped his buddy with some kind of I don't think he said laser, a heat ray or something like that, and it burned kind of a dime-sized hole in his arm or something. And and that letter, he didn't reveal who he was. It was a subsequent letter where he revealed he was Fred Chrisman. Now, this is one of the guys that they think might have been on the grassy knoll with the Kennedy assassination.
Indeed. And later, and Garrison later subpoenaed Fred Chrisman when he was doing the trial down in New Orleans, right? So this is somebody who's involved in the Shaver mystery, as you said, the Maury Island crash, or the Maury Island UFO incident, or the Maury Island hoax, however you want to think about it, the one which ended up with 2 Air Force officers dead who came to retrieve the crash material, and then flying back to base, their plane went down. And then later in the JFK assassination. So this is all part of this weird world of Shaver and Palmer and Chrisman and Kenneth Arnold as well, of course, who has a direct contact with Ray Palmer and is part of the story as well.
Now, there's one other story. I'm going to have trouble remembering a couple of the names, but there was a group of people that they were going to go to this cave in Arkansas. Now, there was another principal that disappeared. This guy, UFO guy, disappeared, and supposedly he was in underground with the Dero, and somehow we got this manuscript out through another person, and it came to the guy's name I can't remember. Bliss. Was it Bliss? Anyway, he's the guy that was going to lead an expedition to Arkansas to this cave, firmly believing they were going to go down into this, I think it was Blowing Cave, and they're firmly believing they were going to contact the Dero. And they had maybe 8 or 10 people, and I thought, my God, they're going to go down into the deep depths of these caves. But then, in classic Shaver Dero evil Ray fashion, he's on his way to go to this cave, and he's attacked by a bunch of yellow jackets and dies.
Good grief.
Almost as if the Dero knew that he was going to go seek and contact the Dero, aimed one of their rays up there. Of course, I don't
hit the nest of the hive of the bees. Stirred them up.
My apologies. My seniorism is making me forget these names right
now.
There's
so many. It's not your seniorism. It's just impossible to keep up. Of course, though, what fascinates me as well is, so the Shaver mystery comes first. It lays so much of the groundwork. And then Kenneth Arnold, the same month that he has his first sighting, in June 24th, 1947, on the newsstands at the time, is the issue of Amazing Stories, which is the Shaver special. All it is Shaver mystery, written by Shaver and other people. One of the articles in there is by Vincent Gaddis, the great Fortean, who's writing about essentially flying saucers before anybody's even talked about flying saucers. And Kenneth Arnold sees in that month these 9 things. These crescent-shaped craft flying at incredible speeds in front of Mount Rainier when he's piloting his private plane. And then, of course, talks to reporters, and headline writers shorten his description that these craft flew like saucers would if you skipped them across the water, to flying saucers. Now, we all know that story. What, of course, you and I both know, but maybe everybody out there doesn't know, is shortly thereafter, Ray Palmer of Amazing Stories and Shaver Mystery fame hires Kenneth Arnold to go and investigate the first real UFO crash before even Roswell, the Maury Island incident.
Right.
And so this is where I think the Shaver mystery begins to transform into the UFO mystery. And I think it's when Palmer almost starts to change his focus from the Shaver mystery to flying saucers. But I think at least in Shaver and Palmer's mind, these two things remain connected.
Right. I think Shaver believed that the Titans and the Atlans might still be piloting craft to and from the Earth and so forth. So, and they were very proud that they were the ones that told us about flying saucers before, the general population knew. So, yeah, these it really is fascinating. I don't think we should spend too much time on Maury Island, but I think that well, let me just tell you one thing. That was Jerome Clark. I talked about a newspaper reporter. He went to go see not Fred Chrisman, but Harold Dahl. Harold Dahl was the guy on the boat that supposedly saw the 5 donut-shaped objects overhead. One had trouble, slag dropped, and supposedly his son was injured and the dog was killed. I think it turned out to be a bunch of BS. But this reporter came up on his back porch when all this was going on, and he was asking him questions. Dahl's wife came out with a butcher knife, and the reporter thought, oh, God, this is it. This is my last day on Earth. And she went up to her husband and grabbed him by the collar, waved the knife in front of his face, and she said, stop embarrassing me with your lies.
Good grief.
So then he admitted that Fred Chrisman rented this room and had this woman come in like a secretary, and it was all a big hoax. Well, this big hoax, and again, ladies and gentlemen, you should research this because it's fascinating, ended up, like you say, with 2 Air Force men crashing in a plane. What a waste. What a waste. And what was Chrisman trying to do? Was he some kind of a government operative to test the limits of belief? I don't know.
That's a good question. And of course, that incident increases FBI interest in Shaver and in Palmer.
Yep.
And they have meetings. The FBI come, I believe, and visit Palmer. They also put supposedly pressure on Ziff Davis, the publishers themselves. And this might be what leads to the whole winding down of the Shaver mystery, or one of the things, because eventually under both hardcore sci-fi fan pressure and one of the partners, Ziff's distaste for the mystery, they were pretty much banned from running Shaver mystery or UFO stories anymore. But what fascinates me is one of those FBI reports, the agent who writes the report suggests that the whole flying saucer fiasco was pretty much the invention of Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver. There's actually there's an FBI memo that says that, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Crazy times. Anyway, I could talk about Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer for the whole season of Talking Weird. We should probably segue into what else we wanted to talk to, and that was, of course, closer to your neck of the woods. I'm near Shaver, where near, of course, Shaver and Palmer were, but you're right bang smack in Mothman territory there, Steve.
I am a few streets from 6th Street, where the Silver Bridge once stood that collapsed back in December 1967.
How's it? I know in the town now it's become obviously a major festival, and people come there to visit the Mothman Museum where you work. I've still got to make that pilgrimage myself. But how do the people in Point Pleasant still, away from the limelight of it, how do the old timers still look at that mystery, that phenomenon?
Well, some of the locals, like Ashley Morrison, who is Jeff Wamsley's daughter. Jeff Wamsley is the curator of the Mothman Museum and co-founder of the Mothman Festival. She has said that, and also Denny Bellamy, another, he works with tourism here, and he's one of the early supporters of all of this. They have said that early on there was a great deal of resistance, and they weren't getting much support from the locals. They didn't want anything to do with it, but now they embrace it. I mean, it's Jeff Wamsley and his family, Denny Bellamy, and the great Carolyn Harris, who we lost a few years ago. She was the other co-founder of the Mothman Festival. She actually lost her little boy on the bridge that night. He was crossing with her estranged husband. But nevertheless, she saw the value in promoting all this, and it has revitalized the town. Jeff has 3 stores. His daughter has a store. People love the museum. I mean, I'm there as kind of the information guy. So I've been following this since November of '66. So, I have a little bit of knowledge, and there's 5 different documentaries going on in the same building. If you go all the way to the back, you'll see the Mothman Legacy, which I happen to be in. So you will see my handsome countenance if you go to the one in the back. But the back of my head is in another one, but that's only for about 2 seconds.
Steve, out of curiosity, I mean, it was such a tragedy, of course, the Silver Bridge collapse, and it's what perhaps brings additional potency to the whole story, to Keel's book and to Gray Barker's book, and to just the mythology around Mothman. Different people have different ideas of Mothman was a herald of doom, or Mothman was there to warn people, or Mothman caused the bridge to collapse. Do you yourself take any position in that kind of discussion?
I don't believe it was directly connected. I think all the high strangeness, the strange lights that were going over all the time, the Mothman, there were cattle mutilations, there was missing time, the Men in Black phenomena. I think it was just all something happened at that time. There are people that believe the Mothman caused the disaster. There are others that believe he was a harbinger. But I've always said, if you're going to be a harbinger, could you be a little more clear? Could you be a little more specific? Like the bridge is going to fall, So, and rather than just chase cars and scare the hell out of people,
Because there was talk, right, about people seeing it near the bridge before, people seeing strange figures like climbing under the bridge and doing things around the bridge. And a lot of these is, my limited knowledge is probably to Barker's book and to Keel's book and to just general, Mothman, type tales. But I think Keel's book talks quite a bit about people reportedly seeing weirdness around the bridge beforehand, right?
Well, one lady contacted Mary Heyer. Mary Heyer was the reporter and a friend and colleague of John Keel. She said she saw 2 men in street shoes climbing around on the bridge wearing, I think, checkered shirts, the checkered shirt phenomena. Now, look, these could have been some legitimate inspectors and nothing bizarre or weird, but it is interesting. I talked to a woman, Linda Sigmund. I've known her a little bit, but she was a Mothman witness when she was 16 in 1967 and saw this thing about 12 miles north of Point Pleasant in conjunction with a strange light. And she said that the December before the bridge collapsed, she was in Point Pleasant and she saw these 2 strange looking men. They're all dressed in black with hats. They had kind of a, in quotes, Asian countenance, as some of the Men in Black have reported, kind of dusky skin. They weren't obviously weren't Asians, and they were just kind of hanging around. There were two of them, just and it was later on she read John Keel's book, and she thought, "Oh my God, this fits the classic Men in Black pattern." I've heard stories afterwards that somebody had seen Mothman around the bridge at the time. I'm not sure if that's the case. It could be, but but there were. I was just rereading John Keel wrote an article in 1968 for the Flying Saucer Review. Now, the Flying Saucer Review was it still is around. It's a great British publication. That the old classics, you can get a lot of them online for a few bucks through Kindle. But they were a superb journal. Well, he wrote a book called about the Mothman, and it was great to have a kind of a refresher. And he said that he talked to a little over 100 people that year that saw this thing. And there was another point I was going to make. I think I just lost, but
that's so good. What interested, I have to just tell a little weird personal story because it doesn't come up that often, and you brought it up, and that's the checkered shirt or somebody wearing a checkered shirt phenomenon. My exposure to that was reading John Keel, like probably a lot of our exposure to it is. And when I was reading him writing about, creepy grinning men in checkered shirts and things, I kid you not, it was, my heart almost stopped. It was one of those biggest goose bump moments in my life. I was reading in my old house where I went when I was at college, and my brother and I shared a little cottage in the suburbs of Sydney. And I was up late one night reading Keel. And I read that passage and I looked up at my TV, which I had muted or very low. And there was a news story, and there was a picture on the story, like a photo of a man on the screen with an insanely large grin on his face and holding in front of him, not wearing, but holding up a checkered shirt. When I read that passage in Keel, and I was like literally, even now I feel the goosebumps because it was just so unsettling. Needless to say, I did not sleep well.
Well, originally, I didn't know what to make of Keel in the checkered shirt. Now, Linda Scarberry, she one of the original witnesses, they saw a manifestation essentially of a man in black, and it had a checkered shirt. It was more of an apparition, though. Now, several years ago, I was down in Tennessee, and I was with a group of people, and you know how you get talking about the paranormal and so forth. Well, this one older lady was talking about this man that appeared next to her bed. And she knew nothing about this. And she said, she looked real puzzled. She said, he was wearing a checkered shirt. And I thought, whoa, wow. And the corroboration of, and what does that mean? Is it light and dark? Does it mean these entities are neutral depending on how we view them? I mean, I'm really going on a limb here, but
or maybe like crossroads because there's those intersections. Yes, right? Who knows? I mean, we could play with the ideas of what it means.
It could be that these guys just have no fashion sense.
Oh my goodness. There was a nice question from Joe Fox, a regular listener, viewer of the show here. And I think this is a wonderful question. He said, Steve, can you describe the ambience on a cool October evening by Silver Bridge, I guess where it went down? It has to be intense. What's the atmosphere like there in October when you're sitting out in your yard, maybe?
It's nobody's ever forgotten it. I guess it's so far in the past. You can it's Point Pleasant. Even though I've been here many times, being here for a full year is kind of new to me. So I love the fall. So I guess it doesn't have a negative vibe, although I used to hate the fall because that's when I had to go back to school. Took a long time to get over that. But no, it's not a negative vibe at all. And I guess living here, it doesn't have that any kind of a negative connotation. But I have talked to a lot of people. There's a great book by Bill and Jackie Kuselis called "Bridging the Tragedy," and he's a psychologist, and he interviewed several of the people that were around that time and what the tragedy meant to them and their family. It's just fascinating. I met one of the survivors that went down on the bridge.
Oh, wow.
2017. It's with 50-year remembrance ceremony. And they read the names of the people that died on the bridge, all 46. The next day, a friend of mine and I met Bill Edmondson. He was a truck driver going across the bridge that night and hauling material to Detroit to make tires. And he described how fast the bridge went down. It was just a matter of like 30 seconds. Richard Gere in the movie had all kinds of time to try to warn people off the bridge. Would that have been the case? And he talked about how the bridge just swayed back and forth. It tilted so far, he was holding on to the steering wheel to stay in place. Now, it's 20 degrees, sun's almost down, bridge is full of traffic, and everything gives way. He's forced through the passenger window, right arm first. He showed us that he had a pin in his arm. He was not able to straighten his arm. And it sounds funny at first, but you know how gentlemen will loosen their breeches to be a little more comfortable driving. Well, so when he hit the water, his pants were dragging behind him. They stayed on because of the 1960s pant cuffs. Now, that sounds funny at first, except, he got out. I mean, he got out of the window. The current started to pull him up. And then something caught his pants, debris or something from the bridge, and started to pull him back under.
Jeez.
He was able to kick himself loose. He came to the surface. That material he had been hauling was floating. His right arm was useless, but he put his left arm in a slit in this material. A tugboat captain saw him immediately and intercepted his flow down river, and they pulled him up out of the water probably moments before he would have died of hypothermia. That kind of thing, it was in stages. When I first read Keel's book, it meant something, that chapter about the bridge. And then I went down in 2006 for my first Mothman festival. And then I reread the book. And then, meeting the people down there, it meant more. And then I read Bill and Jackie Kuselis's book about bridging the tragedy. And, all these things together, I have a great deal of respect for those that survived this terrible tragedy. And honor those that have passed.
Yeah, but it definitely was. What a terrible tragedy it was. In the book, it almost seems like, regardless of Mothman's role, there was some kind of psychic release, and then the Mothman, it had done whatever, it kind of disappeared, or it wasn't as significant anymore. And that seems to be the general type of way most people, I think of the whole mystery, or at least I do. Have there been many ongoing Mothman reports down there? Like, do you guys still get people coming to the museum or locals talking about encountering whatever it is?
Once in a while, yes. There haven't been too many. I'm not aware. I know there have been several. I'm not aware of a lot of them. We just had a message from Ron Lanham. He saw a Mothman-like creature. I don't remember the year exactly. There he is.
It was when I have interviewed a witness who swears they were buzzed by the being 15 minutes before the bridge collapsed, and said it felt like it was sort of trying to warn them away from the bridge.
Oh, interesting. That's something I did not know.
That is interesting. But yeah, I'm just curious how often the thing's still seen there,
But I also wonder, there's a lot of winged cryptids or creatures or what are seen, the Wisconsin man bat, years ago, the Houston Batman, and so forth. I'm not sure all these things are classic Mothman, so to speak, but if we give somebody a primer on John Keel, he talked about transmogrifications of energy. That's not easy to say. And these things possibly being transient, paraphysical, temporal. If that's the case, maybe a lot of these things are coming from the same source and they just manifest differently. Perhaps it's the same energy that created the Mothman, so to speak. I've talked to people that have seen it as an apparition in their bedroom.
Wow.
Classic Mothman.
Wow.
But obviously not flesh and blood, although it did seem to leave footprints, people would experience poltergeist phenomena after they saw the Mothman, sometimes UFOs. Connie Carpenter received conjunctivitis, eye burn, which is usually something you get with a close UFO sighting. John Keel said he found that people that experience cryptids or UFOs, many of them suffered from the same physical effects, conjunctivitis, muscle ache, thirst, and so forth, suggesting that there was a commonality to both in some cases.
I think that what you said is dead on the money. I think a lot of these things are manifestations from the one root phenomenon. So there's all these different phenomena, whether we talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary apparitions, or whether we talk about Mothman or Little Green Man or Bigfoot. My suspicion is a lot of this comes from the same root source. Now, there's no way I can prove that. This is all theoretical, as we know. But as you said, there are a lot of commonalities between what should be very divergent phenomena, and it seems to perhaps indicate that it's coming from the same place. Now, talking about Mothman, let's move away from Point Pleasant for a moment. What did you make of the Mothman flap, which has probably been going on and off in Chicago for the last 5 years or so? Do you think that's related to whatever was seen in Point Pleasant? I guess what we're saying with it's all manifestation from the same thing. The answer is probably yes, but what do you take of those sightings in Chicago?
I think some of them are bogus. I know I have two sources from MUFON that early on, a lot of the sightings were coming from the same IP address. Now, not all of them. Yes, and an excellent researcher named Alison Jornlin, she went a few years ago, and she went to all the different sightings. Now, a lot of people hadn't come forward; they were like blind items. But she went to a lot of these places, and some of the reports didn't ring true. If you're making up a story, you don't get all the details right about the surroundings. Well, she found some problems with that. Although she did find some that she thought were legitimate. It may very well be that some of these, in quotes, the Chicago Mothman are legit. But I actually, to tell you the truth, I kind of ignored it because I know there's some chaff among the wheat, and I don't have any idea how to separate it. I do know that there are two people that were critical about some of the sightings. Well, shortly thereafter, each one of them, there was a sighting, alleged sighting in the town they lived in, as if to say, hey, what's the matter with you guys? You don't believe it. And we just showed up in your town. I don't know if that was legitimate or not.
That's interesting. I think that is problematic I'm not an investigator. I'm a social scientist more than I'm somebody who's looking at a phenomenon. I'm looking perhaps at belief more than anything else. And that's traditionally what I've done since my days when I was still at university. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Keel once talked about something along the lines of you can't ignore the potential hoaxes as well. Perhaps they're somehow part of the phenomenon. Can you remember him writing something like that, or is that a false memory I have?
Well, I think he thought that, I remember him saying something about that. He would hypothesize that sometimes people were, I don't know if possession is the right word, but they would show up on a site and destroy the evidence, the landing marks or whatever, and then take off. So I think maybe that's what you're thinking of.
Maybe.
But I remember one time there was a sighting back in the 70s. It was like a balloon-like thing or a spherical thing. And when you looked at it through the binoculars, it said on it, UFO. Now, that may well have been, Keel thought, well, maybe it's actually a legitimate manifestation, but it manifests in a way to completely disqualify the phenomena. We mentioned Jacques Vallee earlier. He said the phenomena negates itself. Sometimes the experiences are so bizarre that people are hesitant to tell the whole thing that happened. They will eliminate some of the high strangeness stuff. And also, you've got people that they see an object, and then the men in black show up and say, you can't talk about your object, and then it's almost like this is it cancels everything out.
I often wonder too if sometimes people who've had an experience, contactees would be a great example, the traditional 50s contactee. I wonder if sometimes people feel, and this is again hypothesizing, all of this is hypothesis, right? Just theorizing really. I wonder if after seeing something and not having proof, if sometimes people feel almost like they need to make their own proof of it.
Oh, yeah.
Like if you were a contactee and you had this experience and nobody believed you, maybe you go and back in the 50s and take a photo of a trash can lid or a chicken brooder or, whatever the accusations are. Because we live in a society which is so scientifically based that you need to present some type of proof or evidence for your experience. And it's a very different. I was talking to somebody about this tonight, actually. I was at a homeschool end of year celebration for my daughter where the students all show things they've learned. Lovely time. And I was speaking to somebody who you never would think would have come to me with a paranormal experience, because most of the parents are very, high-end professional. They're, very switched on people. And it's always interesting to hear from somebody who's had an experience. But we were talking about exactly this kind of thing. And I mean, today we live in a culture where there's a division between the spiritual and the physical, the real and the unreal, the imagined and the non-imagined. But I think it's a time culturally, which this is new to. When I say this is the last 100 years, I mean a couple of 100 years ago, there weren't these distinctions made between the real and the unreal. If you go back to fairy faith, even in 19th century or early 20th century Ireland, there weren't these hard demarcations between the spiritual and the physical that we make today. And if you went to a non-Western culture today, like if you were to go and I guess hang out with somebody in the Amazon or something, right? A tribesman, there wouldn't be these literal, that's real and that's not real. It's like people who go investigating the Mekele Mbembe. I had a documentarian on here recently, Alex Brasher, fascinating individual who made a documentary recently about the hunt for the Mekele Mbembe. And the tribesmen in that documentary, or the native Africans, they clearly don't demarcate between the spiritual and the physical the way that we do here. And I think the contactees who might have been, and forget some of them might have been full-on hoaxes, but the point is, if you'd had that type of experience a couple 100 years ago where you'd wandered out into the desert and encountered something weird, or wandered into the forest and encountered something weird, there wouldn't have been this cultural pressure on you to present a photograph. Hey, there weren't cameras, but you get my drift. We live in a time where an experience has to somehow be proven. You can't just have a spiritual encounter and not have proof, or it's just dismissed. And I think that might be one of the reasons, to be honest, that sometimes people feel pressured to create proof.
Well, it may be that Woodrow Derenberger actually had some kind of an encounter with Indrid Cold. There's supposedly some people saw him when this craft kind of edged his car off the highway, Route 77, around the Mothman events. Supposedly some people saw him talking to this man, even saw the craft. There was an event that took place just before that was reported to John Keel and Mary Heyer, almost identical to the Indrid Cold experience. A guy going on Route 77, this same elongated craft stops, has another pointless conversation, and he goes to Mary Heyer and he says, I just got to tell somebody. So he relates the story. And then later on, just before Woodrow Derenberger gets, splashed all over the news. And then later on, he decides, no, we're not going to go with it. We decided not to. And so he's talking with Keel and Mary Heyer, and he says, that scientist guy told us we should just forget all about it. And Keel says, scientist guy? He says, well, yeah, he seemed like he knew what he was talking about. And Keel said, well, how did he find out? You mean you only told a couple people? He says, damned if I know. And then there was a woman in Gallipolis a few months later that had a very similar experience, although they didn't identify themselves as Indrid Cold. So it seems like there might be something to it. I don't know what. But my point is, later on, certainly Woodrow Derenberger started getting very fanciful and started making up stuff. His hour-and-a-half trip to the planet Lanulos with scantily clad ladies. There'd be a line going there, I think, if that was a real place. But so I don't know. I think you're right. I think there's, people have that experience, and then there's, they've got to keep it going. They've got to keep in the spotlight. They've got to keep validating themselves.
Quite possibly. I think that might, I don't know if that happens with everybody, but I think it happens with some of these. Nancy Malcolm, another regular listener, viewer of the show, asks an interesting question. Could sightings of Mothman be visual distortion of vibrational plasma, like a portal opening and the Mothman image is a byproduct, like rainbows after rain? Not the same, but I mean like a natural thing. Like perhaps it isn't the phenomenon itself, I guess is what she's saying. It's a side effect of it.
I don't know. It seemed most people that saw it reported essentially the same thing. So if it was some kind of distortion, I'm not sure that it would hold that image. Although its behavior was bizarre. It didn't always flap its wings. I mentioned the poltergeist phenomena that people saw it afterwards. There was a town official, unnamed, that went out on his front porch, saw the thing standing there, and went into a trance for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then when he came out, it flew away. And by the way, John Keel had a couple people where it had a close flyover, where it sounded like something mechanical, something humming. So, there's another wrench in the works.
It's funny because Ron Moorhead, who's famous for recording the Sierra sounds, the Bigfoot kind of sounds, has talked about hearing mechanical type sounds in his experiences as well. David Paulides, of course, Missing 411, some of those accounts have the sound of something like a car door closing or a steel trap going off. So there is something going on here which extends beyond just, I think, a physical manifestation of a flesh and blood creature. There's something very strange going on.
Yes, absolutely. And the way these things, connect, I mean, missing time. Engine stalling. We have about how many hundreds of cases of a close proximity of a flying saucer, UFO, strange light that stalls the car engine. But then we have, there was in the 60s, there was a Dorothy Strong's in a taxi cab in Northumberland, England. And there's this manifestation of a phantom army. And it's the Battle of Otterburn from 1388. And the reason they know that is because the uniforms they're wearing, this is manifested before. It stalls the taxi cab. The fare meter goes crazy, and they feel like they're being hit by a force field. And then it fades away. And then there's the classic case of W.D. Doc Priestley in West Virginia, near Marlington, near the state forest. He's cruising along. His buddies are in front of him in a hunting bus. And all of a sudden, his car stalls. And Mr. Bigfoot steps out to his left. And he's sitting there. He's staring at this thing. He doesn't know how long. His buddies recognize he's not there anymore. And he comes back. And they're coming back. Bigfoot recedes into the woods. He can start his car again. Well, he gets a short distance, and then his car starts to stall again. The engine burns out, and either the same Bigfoot or his kissing cousin shows up again, and that's it. Now, his buddies come back, but he doesn't say anything about the Bigfoot. He actually holds off for several months because he wants to come back and go hunting there with his buddies. And he's afraid if he told them he saw a Bigfoot, they wouldn't come.
That's actually not uncommon that people who are hunters have an encounter with a Bigfoot or something and then they don't want to go in the woods anymore. Not that you can blame them. What do you think about things like Mothman and Dogman and other things that seem, I'm assuming to you and I, somewhat paraphysical, often being kind of co-opted into cryptozoology, like being treated like they're physical flesh and blood beasts? Do you have any feelings on that? Or?
Well, I have spent time with the Bucks County guys that investigated the Dogman on Lee Hampel's farm. Lee Hampel, it's just 0.2 of a mile from the infamous Bray Road in Elkhorn, Wisconsin. He has been taking photographs with trap cameras for the past 10 years. There's like a bizarre technology going on around classic UFOs and so forth. But there's also, he has actually, when he first moved there, some of his neighbors said, there's a werewolf living in your woods back there. And he's like, well, you nuts. He's a mathematician and a chemist. He taught mathematics for decades, and then he saw it. He's seen it more than once, and he's had missing time a couple times. The trap cameras hardly ever catch, they'll catch maybe a corner of these things. And they catch some of the technology or whatever. he has found footprints. These are 5-toed footprints with a pad and a heel. 5-toed footprints aren't supposed to exist like that. And they start on the snow in the middle of nowhere. They split into two, as almost two beasts came out, and then those footprints disappear. They analyzed the hair. There's no medulla. When they try to photograph these things, it's almost like there's some intelligence or something that prevents it. The cameras stop working or whatever. When the Bucks County people were out there, you can check out their video. They started hearing this howling, and it's creepy as hell. I couldn't identify a howl to save my life, but there was one on each side of the field. And then they saw eye shine 6 feet off the ground. They saw a UFO moving around erratically above them before that. And then they saw a strange mist forming, and these mists had been forming there and been photographed. But mist was by Lee Hampel when he was out there according to the photograph, but he didn't see it at all. I mean, this is an incredible hot spot. But you have these animals that seem to pop in and pop out, like it's almost like they're constructs somehow, like a tulpa, or maybe if we go way out on a limb, perhaps this technology or intelligence constructs these things to try to scare the hell out of people. Dominic, one of the guys on the team, is a sensitive, and I asked him how he felt when he was out there. He said, "I felt like I was underwater in a shark cage, and I was holding the bait." They were all kind of freaking out.
I think that was Eric. It's Eric Mentel's group, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I had him on the show talking about it. It's fascinating the work those guys did down there.
Ron recommends talking about orbs. There does seem to be, Paul Devereaux talks about proto-entities. And that's something where sometimes the craft or whatever, the light comes down and then it morphs into the entity. There's even a kind of a Mothman-like sighting. One of the closest sightings to Mothman was almost 3 years to the day before the Scarberries and the Mallets were chased in Kent, England. They call it the Saltwood Horror. It looked like it had no head. It shuffled along, but a light came down first behind a grove of trees and disappeared. And I think the light remanifested, and then they saw this Mothman-like creature. Paul Devereaux talked. Oh, there was another incident, Nottingham Canal. There's 3 boys. I think it's in the 80s. They see this mist rising up out of the canal. There's a couple lights or orbs or whatever. They start moving toward them. 2 of them start to see a shape form, and they never mention Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but the way they described it, it sounds like the outline of a big hairy Bigfoot, but it was translucent and there were no features. So they all take off. The one kid is a little bit unnerved because of these lights and everything moving toward them, but he couldn't understand why his buddies were so freaked out. They are the only ones that saw this image of this Bigfoot or whatever it was. The other one did not see that at all. And you and I know about all kinds of experience where people don't see the same thing, and sometimes they don't see something at all when they're having a joint experience.
It's strange that subjectivity to a lot of this. It's also interesting how some people seem to almost act as umbrellas over other people. So the fact that somebody who's had a lot of experiences might be with people who haven't, those people have an experiences as well. Have you heard about that? Like there might be one person who triggers the experience?
Yes. And also when sometimes during alleged abduction experiences, somebody is having the experience and the other person is not conscious. They can't wake them up, or they're in kind of a stupor.
Right, like it turned off or something.
Let me tell you, I've told this before, but my favorite vehicle stoppage of all time, and it kind of touches on some of the things we just talked about. It took place in either the late 1800s or early 1900s, reported by Elliot O'Donnell, who was essentially a paranormal investigator of that day, wrote all kinds of great books. Mm-hmm. His uncle, he calls Mr. B, is traveling in a cart, a buggy, with one horse on a haunted road going toward Limerick, Ireland. And his driver is his servant named Dunkley. Now, I tell people, if you're going to make up a story, you're not going to make up a name like Dunkley. It's going to be Ralph or Sid or something, right? So they're going along, and all of a sudden it stops dead. And Mr. B turns around and he looks and he sees these little shadowy, translucent figures swarming on the cart. and Dunkley is in a stupor. He's just he can't even function. So Mr. B grabs the reins and they take off. Dunkley comes out of it and he asked him, "What did you see?" Well, in his mind's eye, he saw a troop of dancing fairies. And apparently, when the fairies are making merry, it's a bad news to come on and watch them. And he saw them, and again, his mind's eye, they were climbing on the cart, trying to pull him off. And this guy is terrified. Wow. And it's interesting. Now, we don't know if this is true or not, but it's interesting that they saw these things in a completely different manner. And it makes me think of even Betty and Barney Hill. You know, they did not have quite an identical experience, very similar. Barney had his eyes closed a lot of the time. He was kind of out of it. Betty was completely alert and giving the aliens hell. And they even described the faces a little different. One of them saw, I think it was Betty, saw their noses with two slits. Well, Barney saw the aliens with more of a Jimmy Durante nose.
Yeah.
Now, if you kids don't know who Jimmy Durante was, you Google him and you'll know that that's not a diminutive nose.
Yeah, when you read those original hypnosis transcripts by in Fuller's book, and I think Benjamin Simon was the psychiatrist.
Right.
When you read particularly Barney's descriptions, it changes so often. So initially they're redheaded Irishmen, he says, is what they look like. And then he says they're Nazis. They look like Nazis. They're wearing Nazi uniforms. There's a Jimmy Durante description that you just gave.
Right.
Betty thinks they look like, it's a politically incorrect term now, it would probably be Down syndrome or something, but I think she says they look like mongoloid children that she works with because she was like a social worker or something. There's so many different descriptions in there that it seems to be confabulating and then kind of morphing together to become closer to what we understand the gray alien is today. And interestingly, the TV movie about the abduction, which came out afterwards, I can't even remember the name of it, but
the UFO incident.
The UFO incident. There, the aliens look like they have bigger, blacker eyes, but I think that was just a prosthetic requirement for the actors to see through. Right. So I wonder how much of that later gray description is because of that movie and how much of it is because of the actual account as far as reported in The Interrupted Journey. Very strange. This stuff's also strange.
Have you noticed that the grays didn't really seem to show up in mass until things like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Whitley Strieber's striking book, The Communion, that illustration on the front. But I tell people before that, in the old days, we had cool aliens, man.
I miss those days, Steve.
Oh, listen, the books by the Lorenzens, Flying Saucer Occupants.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
And you were talking about Flying Saucer Review as well. They did a special issue, which later was released as one of my favorite books, Humanoids, where it's got people like Vallee writing in it. Who was the great French ufologist? Well, Vallee's one of them, but it was Amy Michel, I think.
Yes, right.
All these guys are writing in it, and they're talking about all these different type of encounter experiences. This is kind of came out around the time that Condon released as well, so 69, and there's no clear description of what these things look like. It's only, you're right, because of the popularity of Betty and Barney Hill, and then going forward, Close Encounters and Strieber, and like the TV adaptation of Bud Hopkins' books. Like I think it was Intruders became a big TV movie, and all of these things started to consolidate this image that the pilots of the occupants of flying saucers were little gray men with these tear-shaped heads and big black eyes. But before that, it's wonderful to go back and read the early saucer literature. It's so much more entertaining, so much more interesting.
Right. And those days were kind of naive. At least I was. I mean, I was firmly embedded in the ET idea. And I have to tell you that when some of Keel's ideas started to be presented, I could handle window areas, but when I started reading Trojan Horse and he started putting all these things together, I thought, oh, no. And a buddy of mine and I were even bad-mouthing Keel at first, thinking, what's this guy doing? We might as well just give up research, right? But then I was hooked.
Yeah, I think Keel and Vallee both threw these kind of thought bombs into the field, and the craters many of us are still standing in now. We seem almost to. No, I'm serious. It seems like there's.
That's a good description.
Yeah, I actually, it's a description I use in a book I'm writing. It's what it feels like to me, though. These thought bombs were flown and we're thrown, and we're still in the crater saying, hey, this has already been, decided, but it's been passed on. And when you see, the 2017 New York Times story, and then we go to the demands for disclosure again, and the Pentagon hearings and the Pentagon, kind of new programs and the congressional hearings. It's like we're back in the 1960s again, and none of this stuff, which was worked out in the 60s and 70s and 80s by people like Vallee and Keel, is even listened to anymore. We're back to demanding disclosure, and the government have the secrets. It's all very circular and sad.
And what
really.
planet do they come from,
I know, it's crazy. Steve, you were just an amazing guest. I think this is the third time you've been on. We've only had a few guests on that many times, by the way. So it goes to show how highly I think of you. Thanks so much for coming to chat with me again tonight.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'd love to do it again.
We will soon. Have you got some websites you can throw out? Like, where do people listen to your podcast, and how do people see what you're up to at the Mothman Museum, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, it's on the Paranormal UK radio network. The High Strangeness Factor, and I guess it's on many different platforms. So Spreaker is one of them. And I've got a backlog of about 4 years with a little hiatus in there. And just speaking of the Bucks County guys, Eric Mintel, they will be coming out on Tuesday, their interview. I've been on them with several times, including one time with Stan Gordon, and that was a blast.
Wow. I'd love to see that one.
I also, I don't have a website, but you can get a hold of me, Steve Ward, on Facebook. I think if you type in Steve Ward and Point Pleasant, you'll probably find me. And right now I'm just working on Saturdays at the museum. I'm kind of the information guy, greeter, the answer man. And I take people out to the statue as well, which is right next door. And I'm the camera guy. If you want your whole group in there, no extra charge, I'll take care of you. So you will love the museum, and you'll love Point Pleasant and the people there. So, I am really blessed. I mean, I'm right smack in the heart of what I love to do. And it's really great to be on your show to talk about these things. And, I don't get a chance to talk about the Shaver mystery that much either.
Well, I'd just love to talk to you about it. And to be honest, that museum, as wonderful as it sounds, I got to get there, but they are blessed to have you there as their info guy on the weekend, Steve, because there's very few people on the planet who know more about any of this type of stuff than you. So again, thanks, mate. Let's keep in touch, and to you and to everybody out there, until I talk to you all again, keep it weird.